All right, good evening, everyone, or good insert time of day here if you're catching the replay. I'm so thankful to have you with me tonight. We get to talk about a topic near and dear to my heart, something that forms kind of the bedrock for a lot of my underlying daily practice, and that is the system of Reiki. So you are welcome to use that chat feature throughout. I will request for the quality of the replay that you keep yourself muted until it's time for Q&A, and then you're welcome to unmute. If for some reason something goes awry with technology and I don't see what's happening in the chat, of course, unmute and tell me, yell at me, let me know what needs to be fixed so we can make that happen in real time. But otherwise, we're going to enjoy a less formal, slightly less structured talk than I normally do. If you've ever enjoyed an online class with me before, this will be um, not quite the same. It'll be certainly a lot more lax and more conversational. So I'd like to get started by just finding my slides because I switched screens. There we go. And then I'm going to share. Well, hypothetically, I think you can all see a title screen here that says Traditional Reiki, Healing Energies of the Universe with me. Um, so that's our topic for the night. And I wanted to start by just telling you a little bit about me and my journey. So as you can see, I've written a handful of books, more on the way, maybe more on that later. And so far, only one of them is devoted to the practice of Reiki. And despite that, it is a really important part of my everyday life, my spiritual practice, my own journey to health and well-being. And I came to Reiki in the year 2006, May of 2006, after having spent my first year, first two, yeah, I guess my first whole year at college, a year and a half at college, and it was time to introduce some new tools in my toolbox. At that point, I had already been a crystal lover and practitioner of all things rock and gem and crystal related for more time than you might imagine. And I'd kind of hit some plateaus in my own personal well-being. And so one of the things that I'd seen and encountered over and over again was talk about Reiki. So at one of the centers in Southeast Florida, where I'd already been teaching classes for a couple of years, the owner and founder, Patricia Williams, was a really avid Reiki teacher, practitioner, a voice for Reiki in her community. And she'd been, gently hinting that maybe, just maybe, Reiki would be a great tool to have in my toolbox. And eventually I listened. So in May of 2006, I enrolled in my first degree training. And at that point, the style of Reiki that I was learning was anything but traditional when taken holistically. We could see that it kind of sampled from Eastern and Western sources, a lot of them very New Agey. None of those things are bad. In fact, I think that gave me a really healthy understanding of kind of the breadth of what Reiki could cover. But one thing that really stuck out was the way Patricia had such respect and care and attention for where Reiki came from. Herself, she was half Japanese. You'd never know from a name like Patricia Williams, but her middle name, Akemi, is Japanese. And she insisted that we learn how to say the 5 precepts in their original language, that we discuss a little bit more context about Japanese culture and history so we could better appreciate how Reiki developed, how it was born. And she kind of instilled within me this profound love for Reiki's homeland. So I made it my mission to eventually get there. Later that year, also in 2006, July 2006, I took the second degree in that same style, which I think at that point her certificate still called it Usui Tibetan Reiki Ryoho, which was formerly the form of practice that the International Center for Reiki Training kind of promulgated or propagated. And from there, I've had the chance to study a whole lot. In 2009, I made so far my first and only trip to Japan. I received my first in a series of Reiki Master initiations there in, appropriately enough, a Western lineage of Reiki Usui Shiki Ryoho in Inaricho, Tokyo. That same trip, we spent time on Mount Kurama, the birthplace of Reiki. We visited the memorial stone at the Saihoji Temple, where the founder's ashes are interred, where his life story is etched in stone, quite literally. I was able to connect with an international group of Reiki practitioners and teachers, and that just really sparked so much interest in going farther with what Reiki could do. And so I did. When I came back from Japan, I completed my training with my first teacher, Patricia. She, conferred upon me the title that allowed me to teach in that lineage. And since then, I've had the blessing to teach and practice and lead and connect and build community in a variety of different settings. Among the different styles and forms of Reiki that I have learned and consider part of the kind of fabric of my teaching and personal style when it comes to Reiki include both traditional Western and traditional Japanese Reiki and non-traditional Reiki from kind of everywhere these days. I have enrolled in the first and second degree or Shoden and Okuden degrees in the Jikiden Reiki Institute twice over, once with the much beloved Reiki author, Frank Arjeva-Petter, who's the vice representative of the Institute. I I've done some training in the Let Animals Lead method of animal Reiki. I sit on the board of directors of the Shelter Animal Reiki Association. I'm a certified medical Reiki master via the work of my now dearly departed friend, Raven Keys, and have worked with colleagues who take Reiki primarily to spaces like the operating room and other medical settings. So I am really invested in building community and finding what our common currency is within Reiki. And for me, that means distilling my practice to a point where I can understand what its origins are, even if what I do reflects a modern stage in Reiki history. I can clearly see the connections to the historic roots, to tradition, to that kind of, you know, custodial chain, that almost like series of Reiki ancestors that brought us to where we are today. Now, the system, as we're going to learn, is about 101 years old as of this month. And a lot has happened in those ensuing years. But it is my great pleasure to be able to share Reiki with the world at large and with each of you on this call or catching the replay. If you really want like all the names and dates and places about what I've done with Reiki, you can see that on my website. That's not really the point of tonight. I just wanted to highlight that, Reiki in all forms is important to me, and that traditional or non-traditional is not a designation that means more effective or better or less effective or less than in any way. It just refers to the kinds of practices and sometimes the philosophy or the orientation to the world that our practice might have. And I embrace them all. If you go to the grocery store and you go down the freezer aisle, you're going to see more than just one or two flavors of ice cream. And they're all wonderful and they're all valid, and you get to pick the one you want. If you're not an ice cream fan, insert your treat of choosing here. But the goal here is not to disparage any particular system or stream of Reiki. Instead, to recognize that we are a plural community. And when we look to tradition, we can understand exactly how that diverse array of practices branched off from the same common origin. So that's really what we're going to focus on tonight, how we're all related rather than how we're all different. So with that being said, what exactly is Reiki is probably the question we should address first and foremost. And how we frame the answer is going to vary quite a lot, because the word Reiki at face value really could mean a lot of different things. So if if you get, you know, if you as a Reiki practitioner, should you be one, are pressed to give an explanation of what Reiki is, you're probably going to hear in polite conversational speech out in the world, answers that sound a lot like this. A Japanese technique for stress reaction. We might describe it as a biofield therapy if we want to sound really clinical. If we want to be a little bit more woo, we might call it energy medicine or energy healing that supports overall well-being. We could call it a technique like massage or body work that's administered only with light touch that assists in healing. And we could find other ways to kind of describe it, but not really tell people what the word Reiki is. Generally, when we practice, it is done via a gentle laying on of hands, sometimes a laying off of hands, not actually making physical contact. We usually explain the mechanism as being administered via some kind of unseen force, a subtle energy field or a biofield, usually through this concept that a lot of Reiki folks will use of universal life force. In fact, we often see the expression Reiki in Japanese translated, or we'll say transcribed, transformed into universal life force or spiritually guided life force energy, or even just spiritual energy. And these are not literal translations, as we're going to learn in the coming slides, but they are in fact glosses. A gloss is not a word for word transcription of what something means from one language to the next. It's how we interpret a concept. It's how we do our best to convey the underlying meaning of something. And that meaning is relative to context. So we're going to look at some very literal ways to describe what Reiki means when we go to its original orthography, the way it was originally written. So when we do that, you're going to see that expressions like spiritual energy or universal life force are a tiny drop in the bucket of what that expression reiki means in Japanese. So let's start by looking at rei. So we have the kanji there, nice, big, and bold, slightly off center. And this is a word that is simplified in modern Japanese. It is actually written in slightly fewer strokes today, fewer movements of the brush than you see on the screen. But 101 years ago, when the practice was founded, this is the way it was written. And the primary documents, therefore, are written the same way. And so a lot of us kind of maintain that same convention, or in other words, we stick to the traditional way of doing it. And if we take this word and translate it very literally, a modern Japanese to English translation app or a dictionary is probably going to give us something like spirit or soul or ghost, maybe mysterious. And those are true, more nuanced in the conversation, more options that are still factual if we try to translate it. We might get words like energy or ambience or the essence of something. We might see that this refers to certain funerary practices, like the funeral bier on which the remains are laid before being cremated. It can refer to our ancestors. It also implies something that is wondrous, full of wonder, or filling us with wonder, miraculous, something that requires a suspension of disbelief, something mysterious, ineffable, meaning we can't quite put it into words. It also connotes something divine or links us to something divine. Of course, it means something spiritual because we can't really be divine and not be spiritual. And sometimes it just means effective. You find an expression about contemporaneous with the founding of Reiki in some advertisements for what was a new medicine, a new drug introduced to the Japanese market, and that was the word reiyaku, this word plus the word for medicine. And it didn't mean a spiritual medicine. It meant something along the lines of wonder drug. And what was that new wonder drug? It was aspirin. So our concept of what makes something wondrous, miraculous, certainly the bar has moved since then. That we have to remember that there are both mundane and mystical implications in this word. And to really understand the picture this word paints, I think it's useful to understand its etymology, the root words out of which it is comprised. So on the far left, you're going to see a column of three kanji, three Japanese words, with translations underneath them. So we can see that this top part is the word for rain, and then that's clearly visible up here. The word rain in Japanese is usually pronounced ame, and we are depicting something that comes from the heavens. That uppermost line or stroke that's in there signifies the highest plane of existence. We could call that heaven if we wanted to. And then there's, a mass underneath it and little things descending from the mass in the sky. So it's literally depicting raindrops. But there's something kind of poetic here. We're not just describing rain, we're describing the life-giving qualities that come from that divine plane. So yes, it's rain, but rain nourishes the soil. It allows the water in the lakes and streams and ocean to be refreshed. It fills us with life force. So we see this quality of nourishment descending from those higher planes. Now in the middle, we've got three little squares. And if we wrote just one of those squares, the same size as this word, it would mean the word mouth. So we could interpret this as three mouths, or in other words, one mouth being used repeatedly. And it's not someone who talks and talks and talks like me. It's actually someone who's chanting. So it's a chant that causes rain to fall. That is one way we can look at it. There is an alternate etymology that has been proposed, however, and it is this middle character that you see here on the left, a word in Japanese that we pronounce as utsuwa, which means container or vessel. So something that collects and receives the rain. So, of course, if we're talking about literal rain, this is a bowl, but we're not talking about actual wet stuff falling from the sky. We're talking about something more poetic. And this vessel that contains that celestial blessing is your body. You are the container for this divine quality that descends from the realm of the gods. And then at the bottom, we have a word that in modern Japanese is not really read at face value anymore. It has taken on a new connotation. So this is usually written as part of a compound word. If you take this character and you put the word woman beside it, you get a compound word we read as Miko. But even if you drop that second character, you can still read it as Miko because the original meaning is all but forgotten. Now, Miko is a kind of female attendant at a Shinto shrine, not quite a priestess in modern day Japanese religious practice, but ultimately descended from a kind of priestess or seeress who would have had an intimate relationship with the gods and the ancestors. And originally, this character comes from Chinese writing, as all of these do, and it just meant shaman. So the shaman is the intermediary, the go-between, the person who can travel across the threshold, the veil between the worlds, to, we'll say, coordinate with the spirit realm, to enact cures, to bring blessings, to, remove harm, to do all kinds of good things. And if we look at these three parts together, they tell a story, and that story resembles the archetype of what Reiki practitioners do today. There is a numinous, mysterious, ineffable quality that is drawn down from the heavens that fills our body. We become the empty vessel through which this passes. And when we do so, that empowers us to be the intermediary for others, to be the vessel, not just for our own benefit, but to allow that mysterious quality to flow through us so we can bring healing and peace and joy and respite to others. And that very much depicts what we do in the system of Reiki. So, Rei, it means a whole lot of things. But before we think we're ready to move on to Reiki, we have to talk about the ki part of that. So ki, usually in English, we try to render this as something like energy or vitality or life force. that's usually true, except ki can also describe not the mysterious, mystical kinds of energy, but known, measurable, discrete forces like magnetism and electricity. Ki describes atmospheric phenomena. It poetically paints the picture of what's happening with the mind and heart and breath. So some very real translations you might end up with if we try to render this from Japanese into English are concepts that are not always seemingly related. It can mean energy and vitality. It can also mean breath or air or atmosphere, the literal sky above you, but also the feeling in a room. It describes the mind and your senses of feelings, your mood, your spirit, your nature, your essence, your disposition. All of those things are what ki encompasses. And you'll see there's a little bit of overlap between Rei and ki, and that's important. We're going to circle back around to that. So ki is made out of only two parts, which makes our journey through its etymology much easier. That lower part that looks kind of like an asterisk is a rice plant. That's the actual like ideograph, like depiction of, or pictograph rather, of a rice plant with these two little bits not quite attached. That's supposed to represent the rice flour, which is where the grain itself grows. So this is a representation of nourishment. What is the staple of the Japanese diet? What is the staple of the very, very ancient Chinese diet in which this writing system developed, thousands of years ago? Rice. But again, we're not going to read this literally because the next part of this kanji tells us what kind of nourishment, what kind of energy, what kind of fuel we're talking about. And this character above it in modern Japanese means kigamae, or vapor, steam. So it's not just the steam that's rising when we're cooking rice. There are expressions for that. So we're actually talking about something that nourishes us that is invisible or intangible, like steam is. We can feel its effects, but we can't always contain it, especially in a pre-modern world. So this is going to imply, yes, your physical vital energy, but also all of the unseen forces that drive the universe. And there are a lot of really common, ordinary expressions in modern Japanese that use the word ki. If you want to describe someone as being very popular, they have lots of nin ki, the ki of people. If you are describing um, whether there is sunshine or rain or a thunderstorm or hail, you're talking about ten ki, the ki of the heavens, or as we might say, weather. If you want to describe health, you call that genki, which means original energy. And conversely, if you talk about illness or sickness, you talk about byoki, sick energy. And these are not like mystical forces. This is just the textbook word for health is genki, original ki. In fact, if you want to say, hey, what's up? How you doing? In Japanese, you might use the greeting o genki desu ka, which means more or less, we're going to be kind of liberal with this translation, is your ki in its original state? Which is implying, are you as perfect as the day you were made? Are you fulfilling your potential? Are you filled with that divine numinous quality flowing throughout you? Now, the average Japanese person probably doesn't think about that meaning any more than we stop to think about where hello and goodbye really come from. But those are also similarly deep. You should, go on that etymological journey someday if you never have. So rei and ki both mean a paragraph of things. So what happens when we put them together? Well, we get an expression that could, if we try to render it very, very literally, mean something like a spiritual life force. Yes, that one kind of works. We could also be describing a mysterious or miraculous or wondrous energy. We could refer to a kind of power that the soul generates or that is inherent to the soul. We could also be talking about a numinous essence, just something we can experience and we can't quite put it into the words. There's something very mystical about it. The first time in written Japanese that we see this combination of characters, probably written very similarly to how we see it on screen now. Rei and Ki written in old style handwriting and backwards, because that's how it traditionally has been done. The first known reference is about 1,000 years old, and in this story in which it's found, it's describing a kind of strong or holy or mysterious energy, like the ambience around a sacred place. In fact, if you take the words Rei and Ki and put them together in a translation app, you're probably going to get the word aura back. And that doesn't mean your biofield, your electromagnetic field around you. We're talking about that quality, that ambience, that je ne sais quoi. When you walk into a place that you feel, that's the kind of aura we're talking about. And specifically, Reiki is a very sacred or mysterious kind of aura. So if we compare that to universal life force, you can kind of see we've missed something there. And I want to paraphrase from one of my teachers, Hyakuten Sensei, who founded a practice called Komyo Dekido. He likes to use this expression that you can find in some very, very old Japanese writing. You can also find it in like very old style text in Mandarin. And in Japanese, we would read it at ten rei chi ki. And we see the rei and the ki in that. But the ten and the chi are the bits we want to pay attention to, because for the sake of argument, we're going to let rei and ki mean the same thing. They're going to mean the essence of, the energy of, the kind of mysterious qualities of. So ten means heaven, and chi rather means earth. So when we put Reiki together, it poetically describes the energies of the heavens and the energies of the earth working in concert. It is a unity of heaven and earth. It is a lack of duality. It is when we dissolve any opposition between the material and the immaterial, between the earthly and the celestial, between the inner and the outer, that experience that we have is what Reiki is describing. So that is very different than universal life force, but it is in fact the life force of the whole universe. And for that reason, the founder of our practice, Usui Reiki Ryoho, the founder's name is Usui Mikao, Usui is his family name. He says that everything in the universe possesses Reiki, without exception. So this calligraphy brush contains Reiki. This cup contains Reiki. My computer mouse contains Reiki. And of course, the human body, the human mind, the human soul, they contain Reiki as well. And here's where we run into a little bit of trouble, because in English, we use the word Reiki to describe this kind of energy or phenomenon. We also use it just to mean the practice itself, but thankfully Japanese is a little bit more specific. And in Japanese, we actually call it Reiki Ryoho, meaning Reiki healing method. And specifically, throughout history, there's been more than one thing called Reiki Ryoho or Reiki healing method. So this practice, as you'll see on the bright red and white seal on the screen, is called Usui Reiki Ryoho, or Usui's Reiki healing method. In Japanese, this is usually abbreviated. In the 1920s, it was really popular to just take the first and last character out of Reiki Ryoho and call it Reiho. These days, you'll often see practitioners in Japan call it Reiki-ho, Reiki method. But you can, of course, use the whole title. When Usui founded it in very formal documents, he gave it an even longer name. And this longer name, I think, describes a little bit more of what the goals, what the rhetorical purpose of Reiki is. And he calls it Shinshin Kaizen Usui Reiki Ryoho. Usui's Reiki healing method for the improvement of our heart, mind, and our body. Shin and Shin are written with two different characters, but they're pronounced the same. Japanese is like that. And the first one literally means heart, but also poetically means mind. And oftentimes, the kind of emotions and intellect are thought of as part of a larger system rather than as separate concepts like we have in Western psychology. So it's easier to hyphenate the expression heart mind and get it right than to only pick half of that and only be half right. So in the 1920s, when Reiki was founded, there were other kinds of spiritual practices and hands-on healing methods and other things that use the expression Reiki, as well as the expression Reiki Ryoho or Reiki healing method. So we are thankful this one survived. Most did not, but it is kind of separated or distinguished from the others with that longer title in Japanese. But even the Japanese prefer to abbreviate, and we know that they've done so since the very beginning, because Shinshin Kaizen no Iseideki Ryoho is a mouthful, but Reiho, nice and fast. So I don't think there's any problem just abbreviating to Reiki in English. We keep talking about the founder of Reiki, and I want to give us just the tiniest bit of Reiki history. And this is going to be like the hardest thing. Some of you in this call know how I feel about Reiki history, and I am super passionate about it. It's something that I really, really love to talk about and am still refining the research on because new data does come out from time to time. So you have on your screen here three really key figures to the tradition that we know and love today. And on our far left, we have the founder, whose name is Usui Mikao. He was born in August of 1965 in a tiny little village called Taniaimura in Gifu Prefecture. It was a rural place. The kind of social expectation when he was born was that you would kind of, if you were the oldest son, like he was, especially, you would apprentice to do one thing with your life. In a rural area, it would be whatever the family business is. You'd stay home with mom and dad. Your wife would marry into that family. She actually is no longer part of her birth family once she marries, and she's officially part of your new family. And you guys take care of mom and dad, and you have your own kids, and mom and dad pass away, and then your kids take care of you, and your kids, the eldest of which is going to take over the family business, and the cycle kind of continues. And it branches off when families get too large and other things happen. But, you know, Usui lived in a really exciting time. 3 years after he was born, there was major change in the political environment of Japan, which had these rippling, massive effects in terms of the social structure, the culture, the infrastructure. So many things were changing. And this event is called the Meiji Restoration. So prior to this, the imperial family had no power. There was no central figure of authority in Japan, and there were these kind of feudal lords who owned land, and then there was everyone else who was subjugated by them. So the kind of reinstallment of the Meiji emperor as that central figure dissolved that power imbalance as best as possible, at least. It eliminated the kind of warfare, the executive branch of the samurai class, and allowed ordinary people to own land and property again, which is kind of great if you want to exist. So this also meant opening Japan's borders and bringing in Western medicine and learning new things and updating the technology present. So Usui lived in this really uncertain time, and he thrived in many ways. And he did a lot of things that were kind of taboo. He probably had a dozen different jobs in his lifetime. Some highlights include being a journalist, a public servant, an entrepreneur, a business worker, a prison counselor, a lay missionary, and probably a few other things along the way. And all of these things brought him in proximity to the idea that there was more to life, but they never really allowed him to have the experience of what that was to be. So eventually, after more than one business of his allegedly fails, he decides that he's going to cloister himself and try to find a little peace and solace and hopefully experience this sense of fulfillment, this sense of inner peace and harmony that allows you to be truly fulfilled on earth. And after 3 years of retreat, he was not successful, just like the average human being would not be. So he's kind of given a hint by his teacher who suggests that sometimes you just have to die once to be enlightened. And there's a lot of nuance in that expression that gets lost on us today. I won't bore us with all the details, but suffice it to say, this is not always a literal death. This is often a poetic one. So Usui knows that he has to be prepared to meet death as an old friend. He has to be willing to surrender to not just this moment, but the big eternal moment. And achieving that sense of surrender, achieving that sense of, being at peace with things opens the door to a different kind of inner peace. And so he leaves this little Buddhist temple. He climbs a mountain on the outskirts of Kyoto. Do we know why he chose this mountain? We don't. It's a mystical place. It's called Mount Kurama. It's filled with some really fascinating and wonderful underlying mythology. It's been an important part of like the culture of that region for a long time. But more than anything, it is not extremely hard to get to. Even 101 years ago, it was probably relatively easy to reach. And it's not as big and tall and formidable as something like Mount Fuji. So a layperson can just climb it at any point. And that's exactly what happened. And so after about 21 days, 3 weeks or so of fasting on Mount Kurama, his memorial stone tells us that he experienced Dai Reiki no Chu, so the great Reiki of the universe, which touched the top of his head, and that's it. Lights out, unconscious. And when he comes to, the pain of sitting for 21 days, the ache of ascetic work has left his body. The pangs of hunger in his stomach of 3 weeks of no eating have dissipated. And the weight of the world has been lifted from his shoulders. And he observes that something has changed, but not wanting to rush things, not wanting to label it, he decides it's time to go down the mountain and see his teacher. And he stumbles and falls a long way, trips on the cypress roots, and injures his toe. Some say he tears back the toenail. Some say it's just he stubs it. And either way, he does what anyone would instinctively do in the wilderness. You reach down and you grab the part of you that hurts. And the moment he does so, his hands generate warmth, the pain recedes, and that sense of peace floods his body again. When he finally looks down, he notices that his toe has repaired itself. Now, the traditional story tells us there are several more miracles on the way down the mountain and into the city, and ultimately to meet his teacher, where he demonstrates this newfound ability, this laying on of hands that brings relief. And so his teacher, apocryphally it is said, encourages him to go give that to the world. He says, this is the state you've been seeking, Anshin Ritsume, inner peace. So go do what you can to share this with others. So he does so. And the following month, so this is March of 1922, he has this experience. In April of 1922, he founds his Usui Reiki Ryoho Learning Society, or Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai in Japanese, and begins to train and initiate others. Lots of things happen in the next 4 years. But it's important to know that it's only 4 years before he passes away. That seems like an kind of young existence, but we have to understand that the average life expectancy in Japan was significantly less than he lived. He also was able to continue to travel and teach in the last year and a half of his life after a couple of strokes. And given the relative scarcity of interventions for treating those, I think it's pretty remarkable that he was still able to travel and teach and do all of that. In the course of this time, he'd moved his dojo to a larger facility. He began initiating other teachers. And one of, maybe not the very last, but one of those figures who studied with him and became a teacher is the gentleman we see in the middle, Hayashi Chujiro, who was a retired naval captain. He was one of several figures from the Japanese Navy who became high-ranking officers in the association that Usui founded. And for whatever reason, we don't really know what it was, but for whatever reason, he had the ability to do something his colleagues could not, which was practice publicly. Now, the rescripts on like public health and safety were very tight around concepts of alternative medicine, because as Japan was kind of entering the world sphere with its newly opened borders. It was adopting Western medicine, and it wanted to be taken seriously by other world powers, which meant that things that resembled superstition had to like not be very public. So you couldn't be a public Reiki practitioner for money. People couldn't come, you couldn't open a clinic in most cases. So the workaround was Usui created this membership society. Members joined to learn, and then they practiced on themselves and one another or their loved ones. But for some reason, Hayashi sensei was able to open the Hayashi Reiki Kenkyusho or Hayashi Reiki Research Center. And he maintained that. It is thought to have opened shortly before Usui passes away in 1926. And sometime in the first year or two, um, he kind of hives off to turn that research center into a fully fledged institute. And he makes some changes to the system of Reiki. He teaches the first 2 degrees together as part of a 5-day course. So it didn't take months and months and months to level up. He instituted a series of other techniques, which are things I often share in some classes. But most importantly, he actually creates a branch of his own institute. He's got several of them across the nation of Japan, not as many as Usui's, but still he has a good number of them. But he's the first person to open a branch of a Reiki institute outside of Japan. And he does that with the help of the woman you see on the right, Hawaii Takata, who was born to Japanese immigrants who moved to the territory of Hawaii. And she's born on Christmas Eve in 1900. And she has a very colorful life story. I'm happy to recommend resources where you can read lots more about that. But push comes to shove, and she's at a kind of crossroads in her life wherein she has been widowed, has her own children to raise, a slew of her own health problems, and then her sister passes away while her family, their parents are in Japan. So she gets on a ship to do several things: bring the news of her sister's passing to their parents, because you couldn't just send a text back then. That was not an option. She also wants to take her husband's ashes to the appropriate family temple so he can be laid to rest as per his final wishes. And she wants to seek medical treatment because, in the 1930s in the territory of Hawaii, medicine left a lot to be desired in terms of accessibility. So she's going back to her ancestral homeland to receive that. And her version of that story is that she intuitively finds out there's another way. There's some other option to surgery. And so she pursues that voraciously and ends up in Hayashi's clinic. If we look at some written records from the 1930s and 40s, we see that there were actually a couple of Hayashi students already in Hawaii at this point. And so she probably was familiar with his institute through their presence in her hometown, in the place where she lived. Um, However, it worked out. She checks into Hayashi's clinic, receives daily treatment from 2 or more practitioners at a time, and within a week has this massive response to Reiki. Her body just begins to expel all manner of imbalance in some less than pleasant ways, but coming out the other side of that healing reaction or healing crisis, she is invigorated, and she's beginning to feel some major advances in her health and well-being. So she continues treatments and begs to learn Reiki. Now, the story preserved in oral tradition is that she was denied more than once, but eventually she's persistent enough and is admitted. I don't really know how factual that is, but I certainly imagine she was a persistent woman no matter what. So she not only enrolls in Reiki, she actually moves into the Hayashi family home, becomes part of his family to be what's called uchideshi. It's kind of like apprentice. It literally means like inside student or home student. She becomes his apprentice, takes over house visits to see clients, works every day in that clinic alongside his other students. And before she returns to Hawaii, has at least learned the beginnings of how to initiate others. And about a year later, her teacher, Hayashi, comes to Hawaii and confers upon her one final certificate that claims that she, at that point, was one of 13 fully qualified teachers of this technique. And she goes on to teach. And a lot goes on in world history between 1937 and today. Um, but a lot goes on between 1937 and, say, the 1970s, when she begins initiating other teachers at a pretty public pace. So we won't go into all of those details, but suffice it to say that there's this interim period where Reiki has to be adapted to a whole new audience. People don't necessarily speak the language in which primary documents exist. They're not going to be able to understand the original terminology. And so Takata makes some adaptations that are appropriate for her audience, that still convey the essence of the system in a way that other folks can digest. Now, part of that means that she mythologizes the histories of Usui and Hayashi. And so the most prominent story relating to the history of Reiki is, to put it gently, it's a little bit embroidered. There are some not so historically accurate things. There are some things that are not backed up by evidence, we could say. That's my polite way of saying that it's a bit of a fable. But it's an important teaching allegory. And as long as we approach it as such, there may be value in it. Um, Takata does a lot of things to standardize and legitimize Reiki as a practice, to professionalize it so other folks can actually go do it. There are wonderful things that she does through her efforts, and we are all able to learn about Reiki because of what she does. It allows the system not just to take root in new soil, literally and metaphorically, but also to thrive, to become a global phenomenon. So when she passes away in 1980, she leaves behind 23 or more teachers who have to piece together what they know about the system of Reiki and fill in some gaps if there are any, because their teachers no longer extant. As far as they know, there may not be any other teachers left in the world. And so from that point onwards, there are a lot of myths and misconceptions that arise. So I picked 10 that I wanted to focus on for this, just to kind of give us an impression of what happens when we actually look at an evidence-based tradition. So, first and foremost, Reiki means a form of energy healing. And we actually have it in Usui's own words that he never attempted to acquire this. His quest was for something more or less unrelated. Reiki is a spiritual practice meant to encapsulate the goal of Usui's, to reach Anshin Ritsume, or inner peace. The side effect is that, if we focus on that interior landscape, we tend to get better. We tend to feel more at ease. We tend to feel healthier. And, depending on how we want to describe this kind of energetic or cosmic phenomena, one paves the way for the other quite easily. A really prominent story that we find in Takata's version of Reiki history is that Usui was a Christian minister. Except nowadays, there are a lot of people who want to tell you that he was a Shingon Buddhist, a Tendai Buddhist, a Zen Buddhist, a Tibetan Buddhist, all kinds of other things and whatnot. Usui was familiar with the doctrines of a lot of teachings around the world. His memorial stone says that he was well versed in the texts of Buddhism and Christianity and Taoism and Shinto, that he was well learned in psychology and the art of divination and physiognomy and the art of incantation. He studied a little bit of everything. So he certainly was familiar with a lot of these doctrines. But we know quite unequivocally what his kind of religious affiliation would have been by birth and by death, because we know where he went to school and we know where he's buried. And they're both Buddhist temples. There's specifically Jodo Shu, or Pure Land School Buddhists. So we can kind of put to bed a lot of the other rumors. Another popular myth is that his goal was looking for hands-on healing. And Takata's story very poetically kind of paints him as the figure of a Christian minister, the head of a Christian academy in Japan. And when asked, hey, if you believe the Bible is literally true, can you demonstrate the same miracles that Jesus did? And, unable to perform hands-on healing and enact miracles, he left to pursue other things, which led him to study older systems of healing, and eventually Reiki is born. But the truth is, in his own words, it was an accident. His quest was not aimed at hands-on healing. It was aimed at inner peace. The fact that reaching that inner peace allowed him to generate this healing effect was secondary to his goals, but also it was something tangible he could share with others. And through learning the hands-on healing, we can also get closer to that same sense of inner peace. We also often hear it repeated that there are 4 or more Reiki symbols that appeared to Usui on Mount Kurama. Some versions tell us that he discovered them in Tibetan sutras. That might sound well and good if any of them were actually written in a Tibetan script. One of them is almost written in a script that resembles Sanskrit, but it's not. And also, it's pretty well documented. We have the evidence that tells us that Usui only taught one of the 4 symbols popularly known in Western Reiki. And in my secondary classes, I go into greater detail on that. Today, we have 3 symbols in the 2nd degree. And one of those was used by Usui Sensei to assist people who are having difficulty with long distance healing. The other 2 symbols, what we think of as the 1st and the 2nd symbol taught in the 2nd degree, actually date to the 2nd president. So when Usui passes away in 1926, Ushida Sensei becomes the next president of his association, and it is during Ushida's time at the helm that those other 2 symbols are incorporated into the practice of Reiki. And the 4th symbol is complicated. And we're just going to leave it at that. Margaret knows why it's complicated. um, so ultimately, they were chosen because they are effective tools, but we can think of them more as training wheels rather than as essential elements of the system. They're there to help us get closer to what the goals of the system are. There's also this myth that I'm really guilty of myself, and that is that stating that Reiki is a purely Japanese practice. And the best scholarship actually tells us that the philosophies that underpin the system of Reiki are the result of a melting pot of influences coming to Japan. We see the influx of the New Thought movement, which is very well evidenced in the 5 precepts. We see other kind of mystical ideas woven into that fabric, and those certainly influenced Reiki quite directly. So Reiki is not purely Japanese. Now, you'll also see folks say that it's definitely not Japanese because it comes from Tibet. Except why would we have symbols or characters that are definitely in Japanese writing if they were from Tibet? And it's definitely from Tibet, except for when it's from Atlantis or Lemuria or the Pleiades or some other place. So, Occam's razor tells us that the simplest answer tends to be the one that is true. We do not have unequivocal evidence that Reiki comes from any time or any place except Japan in 1922. In fact, all evidence tells us that's exactly when and how it happened. Maybe through a confluence of forces, but that is the place in which those events happened. So we know that it doesn't come from anywhere else. And to represent Reiki as anything other than this product of circulatory development in the Northern Pacific that took place in 1920s Japan is not helpful to the Reiki community at large. Another popular myth that we see repeated over and over again is that there are somehow secret lineages that have been rediscovered that preserve the original teachings of Usui Mikao. And I put that in bold with the TM by it because that's kind of the point here. There are lots of folks out there who'll tell you that they have rediscovered the secret lineage, and for only insert exorbitant number of dollars here, you too can learn it, but you're not allowed to teach it to anyone else unless you enroll in this course and that course and the next one. And this has actually been going on for quite a long time. Longer than you might imagine in the history of Reiki. And there is actually a small amount of truth in this, inasmuch that the system that Usui taught still exists in modified form in Japan and is still held in safeguard by the organization he founded. You or I probably will never get the chance to participate in anything they do, and that's perfectly okay. Part of the reason for that is they only do business in Japanese, so you can't attend a meeting if you can't understand it. And my Japanese is not conversational, let alone a formal situation like that. So I'm pretty much barred from entry there. And because it is a membership organization, new members have to be introduced by existing members. They have to be voted in. There are all kinds of rules, just like any other kind of secret club. But the thing is, when you join, you sign an NDA. You don't get to give away those secret teachings. So anyone who's claiming to have the secret teachings, they probably don't. There are secret teachings in the system of Reiki. For example, in the second degree, you learn certain symbols and or mantras and or other techniques. In the third degree, you learn how to teach those things to other people. Those are secrets because they only work when you are part of that context. Not because we won't let the general public have them, but because they're what we call esoteric teachings. The information is only applicable when you have the relevant experience. Um, So sometimes we see it said that Reiki is affiliated with a specific religion or religious practice. Usui was Buddhist, therefore you must be Buddhist to practice Reiki. No, definitely not. The Constitution of Japan, when he was alive and well, made it really easy to start new religions. In fact, several of his colleagues and contemporaries did start new religions. Many of them included Reiki-like things with hands-on healing. Some of those Reiki-like things that predate Reiki still exists in the world. They are sometimes regarded as what we call new religious movements, but Usui made his practice for everybody. You don't have to believe in any particular thing. In fact, in his own words, you don't even have to especially believe in Reiki. If you're just willing to try it, it's probably going to work. Here's another one. You need an attunement to channel Reiki. And this is complicated. My relationship to this myth has changed over time. Because I feel like some of the dogma we're taught in some Reiki circles is less useful. If, in the founder's own words, everything in the universe possesses Reiki without exception, what ritual can I enact that that can give you something you've already got, right? That's not really what the rhetorical goal of an attunement, or what we call reiju, which means more or less like spiritual blessing or mysterious gift in Japanese. We often refer to that as an initiation in English, but attunement is certainly by far the most common word we see today. And I think that initiation experience is really pivotal to the system of Reiki, the practice of Usui Reiki Ryoho. But the Reiki of the universe is in the whole universe. And I don't need to give you a special wave of my hands and tap on this part of your body or blow here or wave my hands in some silly direction there. None of that takes away from or adds to the Reiki that is in your body. Instead, the goal of initiation is to have the initial experience of that inherent connection between you and the universe. There are some other things initiation does, but that's like one of the most important things. I'd also posit that we don't actually channel Reiki. That implies a more active role than we as Reiki practitioners have. We allow ourselves to be passive vessels. Some language that Hiroshi Doi, the founder of Gendai Reiki-ho, uses that I'm quite fond of is it's more like finding the resonance between the Reiki of you and the Reiki of the universe. They're already one, but we've forgotten it. So when we harmonize those two spheres of influence, we feel the effects of Reiki. And that's a really passive thing. Also, one that you hear a lot is that certain styles of Reiki are more powerful or have a higher vibration than others. But here's my question. If Reiki, the word, the phrase, describes a phenomenon that only exists in the non-dual state, how can you have something that is equivalent to infinity plus one? This is a logical fallacy. It doesn't work. Reiki just is. After initiation, after our induction to the system of Reiki, we all have the same Reiki hands. whether you've been practicing for 1 day or 10 years, the Reiki is the same. There's only one Reiki. Now, your approach to it, the tools and techniques you learn, they're going to differ. And I think that's actually really beautiful. And then another one that I see is Reiki practitioners have to be careful to protect themselves from healing others. And several issues with this sentence, right? We're not really doing any active work. I'm not healing anyone when I practice Reiki. Um, who is the healer? Wherever my hands are placed, that person, that space, that phenomenon is doing the healing. I'm just witnessing it. I'm just holding space for that to happen. Um, and if that's all that I'm doing, what do I need to protect myself from? Again, if Reiki is this non dual force of heaven and earth uniting, if I have the whole of the cosmos within me, why do I need to separate myself from some other part of the cosmos through protection? And it's a philosophical thing. I'm certainly not going to tell you if you're a highly sensitive person or an empath to go in without armor. Just that the system of Reiki has its own kind of safeguards that we're not going to pick up on people's stuff just because we're practicing healing. So those are some of my favorite myths and misconceptions to bust. And I want to talk a little bit about, why make a big fuss about traditional Reiki in the first place? Well, I can only answer this for me. I imagine I can probably answer this for the community of students who've studied with me as well, because they probably like a lot of the same things that I like. So when we say the word traditional, it probably makes you feel a strong way about something or other. Um, it tends to denote a range of cultural, historical, and practical meanings in the Reiki context. Something is traditional if there is a tradition, if it has been done over a certain length of time by a certain number of people. Now, how long? That's that's hard to say, right? If Hawaii Takata passed away in 1980, that's 44 years ago. That's slightly more than 2 generations by the average generational reckoning. That's enough for a tradition to exist. So something can be traditional without being ancient. And I think that's a really important thing to note, especially since Reiki, Usui Reiki Ryoho, the practice of Reiki, is not an ancient practice. It is from 1922, which feels really ancient, but it's not. So when we say traditional Reiki, you might think that this is a kind of semantic thing that we do here in the West to make some things feel more important than others, but actually, this is a direct translation of a Japanese phrase, Dento Reiki, which you'll see here in kanji. And it was actually coined in Japan as a means of distinguishing what had been done in Japan from what was coming back into Japan from the rest of the world. Because, believe it or not, the most popular styles of Reiki in the whole world, including Japan, are non-traditional styles of Reiki, are Western styles of Reiki. So it was just a way to kind of differentiate this style of practice versus that style of practice. Not better than or worse than, just different. That's all. There are traditional strains of Western Reiki as well. These often preserve the teachings of Hawaii Takata, and they represent a really important transitional phase in Reiki's development. How Takata taught in the 1930s and 40s probably looks pretty darn different in some ways to how she taught in the 1970s. And in other ways, probably not so much. So traditional doesn't just mean Japanese. I don't want us to only equate it there. So the primary goals of traditional Reiki are aimed at personal development. This experience that we call Anshin Ritsume, a state of living in total harmony with the universe, complete inner and outer peace. Sometimes this is a state that is described as a kind of inner peace that no matter what's happening in the world around you, you can hold on to that peace and share it with others to fulfill your life's purpose. As Reiki developed and globalized, the shift happened so that Anshin Ritsume, which was primary, became secondary, and hands-on healing, which was secondary, became primary. But I'm going to let you in on a secret. Whatever part of Reiki we're attracted to, whichever bit we tend to focus on, all the other things that it does, kind of happen in spite of ourselves. So if your goal is to learn something for natural pain management, you can probably get that really effectively from Reiki. I myself have, but you know what? When I'm sitting there doing hands-on healing after I had my motorcycle accident in 2012, it wasn't just my knee that felt better. It was my heart. It was my emotions. It was my fear. It was the worry of like, how was I ever going to work out all the stuff that needs to happen next? And you know, I survived in more ways than one. And not always because I was doing Reiki on my knee, right? Because there is this kind of higher intelligence that allows it to permeate all parts of you. Um, as we learn about traditional approaches to Reiki, it helps us understand how it has branched and forked and become multivalent, how it can mean more than one thing at a time to more than one person at a time. And I love how when we go back to the evidence and the history and the tradition, we can see exactly where these forks in the road are. And I have a better appreciation for the things that I do that are non-traditional because I can see how they've evolved. So traditional Reiki can give us that insight, and it can also offer fresh things because a lot of what we call quote unquote Dento Reiki in Japan was all but forgotten until the early 2000s when it reemerged and was brought to the rest of the world. By that point, Reiki had been taught outside of Japan for the better part of almost 70 years. So things changed. It's just the nature of the universe to change. Traditional Reiki benefits as well from what we could call the inertia of our Reiki ancestors, the current of work, the links in the chain that go back to the founder. Those kind of spiritual ripples are still there. In any form of Reiki, they're still there. I do not want to imply they're only present in traditional forms of Reiki, but when we can do something as close to, if we can approximate the way the founder did, or another pivotal teacher in our lineage did, it really helps us tap into their goals, their insights, their realizations, the magic they had with Reiki. So I love highlighting and honoring tradition because it magnifies the results that we experience right here, right now. So with that in mind, what might be different? Well, traditionally, Reiki has three-ish degrees. We're going to say ish because it's complicated. They were subdivided, and different teachers subdivided them slightly differently. You had, for example, Okuden Koki and Okuden Zenki in the Gakkai, in the society Usui founded, which means the first part of the second degree and the latter part of the second degree, but they were still just the second degree. In some traditional styles of Reiki in Japan, you find the third degree broken up into at least three parts. You learn shihan kaku, you become an associate or assistant teacher or instructor, then you become shihan, and then you become a senior instructor or senior shihan. And those reflect which levels you're allowed to teach. But still, we broadly have three degrees, which we call shoden, okuden, and shinpiden in Japanese, which means more or less um, beginners teachings or entrance teachings, inner teachings, and the mystery teachings. Now, in non-traditional Reiki, there can be three or more degrees. Sometimes the exact same three-step process is taught. I have seen at least one author suggest that Reiki should be taught in 21 degrees. I think that's a really clever way to keep people coming back for more. I think three is plenty. I'm really happy with three, and that works for me. In traditional Reiki, we have three or four symbols because something Hawayo Takata taught in the 70s is, traditional by now. Even if she never meant it to be a symbol, it kind of is. Um, but in non-traditional Reiki, we can usually have somewhere between 4 and well over 100 symbols. That's not an exaggeration. There is at least one Reiki practice in the world that alleges to have over 1,000 symbols, but most of them have been forgotten, so you have to channel them yourself, which is more work than I would like to do. So I'm going to stick with my 3 or 4 symbols. We also see in traditional Reiki that each one of those symbols has a specific application and therefore a regular outcome. Now, in non-traditional Reiki, symbols are sometimes used through this concept that we call magical thinking. if I do this, then anything can happen. That's not a bad thing, but it's not always the same localized, specific application and outcome. So you're sometimes left wondering, well, when is the right time to use this versus that? And tradition tells us this is how it was done. Try it this way. The traditional Reiki techniques are often a core part of traditional Reiki, but in non-traditional Reiki, we might see other elements like chakras and crystals and other New Age concepts that are there to fill in some gaps. In traditional Reiki, we have an emphasis on the 5 precepts. In non-traditional Reiki, the emphasis is on energy healing. We have a clearly defined lineage, usually, versus one that may or may not be defined in non-traditional Reiki. Reiki, as I teach it, traditionally has an evidence-based history, although there are traditions that use an oral, we'll say poetic rather than factual history. And in non-traditional Reiki, we can have channeled information. We can have a revisionist history where someone is applying their own goals, their own biases, and retelling a narrative, sometimes making one up. Not usually, but sometimes. Um, in traditional Reiki, we have the spiritual goals as our primary ones. The therapeutic intervention is the secondary goal. And we've got that flipped in non-traditional Reiki. When we do our hands-on healing, traditionally, it's driven by this concept called byosen, which is a kind of energetic feedback system we learn to perceive through the traditional teachings. And in non-traditional Reiki, we might have structured hand positions. We might be led by intuition. We might also have learned to adopt byosen. Traditionally, multiple empowerments or blessings or attunements are given per degree. And in non-traditional Reiki, sometimes it's as little as 1 per degree. And in traditional Reiki, we think of Reiki as a way of life. In non-traditional Reiki, it can be a simple technique, it could be our profession, or it could be our lifestyle. Any of those are applicable. And there's a note out in here. Now there's an asterisk at the top, and I think it's really important to address this. Even though I've said it, we're going to say it again. This reflects how I have come to learn and practice and teach. These are things I've learned through direct transmission and research, through trial and error. Not all traditional or non-traditional lineages have the same curriculum. What I teach in the first degree might not be what someone else teaches at the first degree, and that's not a morally good, right or wrong kind of thing. It's just the way it is. Neither traditional nor non-traditional Reiki is inherently better or more powerful than any other, and it is only by practice alone that we become proficient and effective practitioners. So regardless of what the curriculum is you're learning, just do the practice and you become a better practitioner. We're just comparing what that content might look like. So with that in mind, I'm going to pause. Do we have some questions so far? Now that I've yammered on for over an hour without a break. Questions, comments, concerns, you're welcome to unmute. You can type into the chat. You can click the little raise hand feature as well. If there are no questions, I've either done a great or a terrible job. I will let you decide which. And we're going to kind of shift gears here and get a little bit more practical. So I have a series of little exercises or meditations that we're going to do together. And I want to give you a little taste of what the kind of inner landscape of traditional Reiki could feel like. Here's a question, a couple of questions. So Pat asks, I wonder if you have any sense of whether or not Takata Sensei was in an internment camp in World War II. She was not. So we actually have documentary evidence that she was not. And the main reason was that people of Japanese descent represented too large a percentage of the workforce in Hawaii. So they categorically did not employ these camps there. So if you stayed in Hawaii, you probably couldn't travel. That you were not put into a camp because it would have shut down the entire economy of the territory. So nobody was. Now, maybe if she'd been traveling through the mainland at that point, it could have been a different story, but no camps for her, thankfully, because that also means that she was around still to share Reiki with the world. Um, my pleasure. And then Kimi Cat is asking, why has the attunement part been shifted? There are actually a lot of reasons. So, first and foremost, some new stuff that I've been taught by a colleague. Um, Usui's approach to giving the quote unquote attunement, which he called a reiju, was probably initially very fluid. He had to accommodate large groups. His classes were very popular. He taught more than 2,000 people in a span of 4 years. So he did create structure. There was a formal ritual that he taught. Probably it is the same or pretty darn close in the Usui society today. Uh, can we know that for sure? Unfortunately, we can't because we're not members. But we can assume it's probably got to be pretty darn similar. One generation of practitioners later, Hayashi Sensei has changed the style of initiation. I can't tell you why he did that. But if we look at a cross section of practices, we can see that it shares a lot of DNA with earlier iterations and with later ones. And my guess is some adaptations were made to incorporate the newly added, newly amended symbols to the system of Reiki to make them part of that initiation practice because they are kind of like training wheels. They help us attain the level of consciousness that makes it easier to lead others to have that experience of the indwelling Reiki. And then, that is further refined and developed in the Western world because, I mean, largely the the mindset the average American consumer has, even people who are workshop attendants, they are consumers. We have to label them as such for this. If they find out, hey, there are these things that you teach in the second degree, can I just have them now? That's a very American way to think about it, right? I want more, I want bigger, I want better, I want faster, and I want it now. So then the framework for initiations changed. The concept of levelization was added. It used to be there was one ritual. You repeated it over and over again in the first degree, the same ritual over and over again in the second degree, over and over again when you met with your teacher outside of the seminar. And the goal was just to receive that blessing. But it was later amended to reflect discrete degrees, and only when you'd received a specific ritual sequence of an action of actions at the second degree could you use the second degree symbols and so on and so forth. So part of that is cultural. So um, we are where we are because of that. Um, uh, so there's probably a lot more we could say, but we're going to put a pin in it there for now. Tali is asking about my favorite part about working with animals. There's too much to say and it won't fit in the limited time that we have here. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll talk animal Reiki in a future setting. But if you are looking for more resources to learn more about animal Reiki, you can check out Shelter Animal Reiki Association or go to animalreikisource.com. Those would also be great places to look. Um, and thank you for all the other comments that are in there. For those of you that have to sign off, no worries, you will get a copy of the replay. So thank you. All right, so on this note, let's shift gears just a little bit. I want to end with a little bit of practice that we can share together. Once I find where my screen share button went, there we go. So if I've done this correctly, you will see the 5 precepts on the screen. I see some nods. Okay, then I did this correctly. So these are the heart and soul of our Reiki practice. And the whole text is longer, but these 3 really tall lines in the middle are the 5 precepts themselves, which kind of reduce down to today only. Anger not, worry not, be grateful, be humble, and be kind to people. And I'm going to recite those at a certain point tonight. But I just wanted you to see them. We don't have time to go farther in depth because I already rambled too long. But the good news is if you do want to go very far in depth, you can check out the book, Foundations of Reiki Ryoho. It's got a whole chapter devoted to them. So we are going to do a little meditation that's called Joshin Kokyu Ho, which in Japanese more or less means to purify the heart, but also the mind, because they're the same thing, with the breath. And Jo is pure, Shin is heart, mind, Kokyu is in breath, out breath, and ho means method. So I'm going to invite you to get really comfy here. Just relax into whatever posture or position works well for your body. We're going to allow any tension in your body, mind, and spirit to melt away, melting like a light dusting of snow in the sun. Worries and troubles evaporate, so you feel yourself nice and free and clear. And I'd like you to bring your awareness to a point just below your belly button, about an inch or so below the belly button. We call this the lower tanden, a word in Japanese that means elixir field, kind of like energy center. And if you'd like, you can put one or both hands over that point just to help you keep your awareness there. And as you breathe in, I'm going to invite you to inhale your awareness, your attention, your focus all the way down into this point below the belly button. And as you exhale, let your awareness spread outwards again, filling your whole body. Breathing in and drawing your consciousness to a single point below the belly button. Exhaling and allowing the breath to expand from the navel. As you breathe in, I want you to become aware that you breathe in not only air or oxygen, but also that mysterious quality that is Reiki, because all things in the cosmos possess Reiki. Every molecule of air is filled with that. So we draw in Reiki, we draw in breath, we draw in light deep into the belly. And as you exhale, you allow that to expand through all parts of your being. Breathing in the light of Reiki, compacting it to a single point in your belly button, exhaling it outwards in all directions so that your belly shines like a miniature sun. Every breath in centers and strengthens you. Every breath out purifies and clears you, body, mind, and soul. We're going to move to the next step of our meditation. If you'd like to see the name on the screen, you may open your eyes and check it out. This is called Tenchi Meso. This is actually a reconstruction of a few things. Certainly things that are found in Reiki, but elsewhere. The word ten means heaven, chi means earth, meso is meditation. So it's the heaven and earth meditation. And we're going to become aware of those qualities of heaven and earth becoming one within us. So we're going to be more or less aware of our belly, our heart, and our head. We're going to do a slightly simplified version. I teach a more complex version of this in the third degree. But for right now, let's close our eyes and imagine the earth beneath your feet. You can just feel the pull of gravity, the weight of your body in your chair, the feeling of the soles of your feet against the ground, whatever works for you. Just become aware of your interface with the planet, with the earth. And on the in-breath, we're going to draw that up through the belly and into the heart. And on the out-breath, we're going to release it up through the head and into the universe. Let's breathe in a couple more times from the earth. Into the heart, out to the universe. Into the heart, and out through the universe. And now become aware of the sky, the cosmos, the universe all around you. Let's draw in that heavenly energy through the head and into the heart as we breathe in. And as you exhale, just let it continue to travel through you and into the earth. Repeating that celestial breath, drawing in from the heavens and down to the earth, into the heaven, from the heavens, and down into the earth. And now I'm just going to invite you to breathe normally, knowing that with each breath, you're drawing in from heaven and earth. And if you'd like to receive a special Reiki blessing, what we call kokai reiju, which means open reiju, can bring your hands together, palm to palm in front of the heart. Focus the breath within you, combining heaven and earth. And listen to the words of the 5 precepts in Japanese. Kyo dake wa ikaru na, shinpai su na, kansha shite, gyo wo hageme hito ni shinsetsu ni. Kyo dake wa ikaru na, shinpai su na, kansha shite, gyo wo hageme hito ni shinsetsu ni. Kyo dake wa ikaru na, shinpai su na, kansha shite, gyo wo hageme hito ni shinsetsu ni. Kokai Reiju Hajimemasu. Open Reiju will now begin. Just open your heart. And if you'd like to receive this blessing, just affirm so. Kokai Reiju owarimashita. Open Reiju is now complete. I'm just going to invite you to place those Reiki blessed hands anywhere on your body that feels nice. Becoming aware of the inner Reiki harmonizing with the Reiki of the universe, allowing it to flow however it wants to, carrying that blessing forward for you. When you're ready, take a couple of deep breaths and open your eyes. If you'd like to leave your hands in place, just allow them to continue flowing Reiki. You can do that. So we do have some ways for you to learn more. Let's say you enjoyed this talk. You like this kind of approach to Reiki history and tradition. Maybe you enjoy the experience of receiving Reiju and practicing the kind of inner part of Reiki. I've got good news for you. You can take me home with you, in fact. So a lot of this content is going to come out of my book, Foundations of Reiki Ryoho, a manual of Shoden and Okuden, and the team at Circles has graciously offered to give us a 15% discount on all of my books, not just this, but if you're into rocks or flower essences, I got some stuff out there you might enjoy. And that will be through this month and next month. I'm also offering some in-person Reiki training at Circles of Wisdom on April 26th through 28th. So if you'd really love to participate, I would love to have you there. If you have studied with me in the past, we've got options for you as well. You can, there's a one session of the day is just, or the weekend rather, is just for practice, and all my previous students are welcome to come free of charge for that. And there's also an option to re-enroll at a massively discounted rate. If you're not local, Circles of Wisdom does have a relationship with a local hotel, and they can get you a discount code. Just reach out. Kathy said that they just recently got that squared away again, so it's much more user friendly. Um, and also, if you're not local and can't travel, I do monthly Reiki sessions online, similar to this, but with a much stronger emphasis on doing and less on talking. My next one of those is going to be on March 17th, and I'm going to pop a link in the chat in just a moment. But you can also reach out with Reiki questions. I'm happy to hang on the line and answer more questions for the next few minutes, but I just wanted you to have my contact details. So if you want to reach out via my website, it's theluminouspearl.com. While you're there, scroll down to the bottom of the homepage or go visit the contact page, and you can sign up for my newsletter, which comes out a couple times a month, which gives you an idea of my upcoming events and other fun things. You can find other things that I do via social media as well as on my link tree. So let's go ahead and we're going to close the screen share first by saying thank you very much. Domo arigatou gozaimasu, as we would say in Japanese. So let's go ahead and just put some of this in the chat for you now. So if you're interested in what Circles has to offer with me, I've got a crystal class and Reiki training coming up this spring, plus books are on sale. So you can find out those details there. And if you want to reach out to me, you may do so via my website, which is there, or sign up for my newsletter there. If you want to check out my next free online Reiki share as well, which is more practice oriented, I've got that link for you in the chat. So if anyone has questions, I would love to answer them. I see the first one has come from Lolly on in the chat, who asks, will you ever teach Reiki online? Now, the traditionalist in me absolutely put this off for as long as I could. And I've only recently had my first experimental class. It went well. I'm happy to say I look forward to doing it again. I don't have that on the calendar just yet. Eventually, it'll go on the website and my calendar when I do. But the good news is that I regularly teach Reiki in person as well, not just in the Northeast, but sometimes I get invitations to go teach in other places as well. So you never know, I might come to a spot near you. So there are plenty of options to learn. And once I have more dates for future travels or online options, it'll all be on the calendar on my website and announced via my newsletter. So thanks for asking. Now, are there other questions? Is there any other way I can support you all on your Reiki journeys? So Kristen asks, how often should Reiki be done to get the most healing benefits? Well, you know, if you stub your toe, you can probably give yourself a short Reiki treatment and feel better. If you've had lower back pain for 20 years, you probably are going to want more than one 15-minute Reiki session. So there is not an easily prescribable schedule that we can follow, unfortunately, because we're all unique. The real agent that's doing the healing is you. So the more frequently we can practice Reiki, the better. If we have chronic long-term things, become a Reiki practitioner yourself. I use it to manage chronic illness in myself every single day. And the days that I really commit to my practice tend to be better days than the days I don't. But if you want to go see a Reiki practitioner, if you want someone to practice for you on your behalf, however you want that to look like, I would say chat with that practitioner and, you know, come up with a plan together to see what's going to work best for you. So Heather asks, as a beginner, would it be best to take Reiki 1 and practice prior to taking Reiki 2? So historically, there are precedents for both of these options. I always encourage people to learn at the pace that feels the most comfortable for them. Usui required a kind of longer, more arduous route to becoming a second degree practitioner, at least some of the time, and his society maintains those conventions. But as of 1927 or so, we have, at least as of 1927, we have evidence that Hayashi Sensei was teaching first and second degree together over a 5-day course. So that's almost 100 years of doing it that way. And both options work for you. So usually I like to teach when I come in person, like I do at circles. I offer them over a span of 3 days. It's a day and a half of training for each one. So we can cram them into 3 days. They're 3 very full days. Um, and if you're only comfortable doing first degree, just do first degree. If you would love to learn both of those sets of curricula together, they're complementary, you can. There's no right or wrong way to do that. So I always encourage people to do what's going to work best for them. And some teachers and traditions have rules to follow. I'm open to my rules not being the best for everybody. So, if someone else says, nope, you have to wait a certain amount of time, and that's your teacher, and that's the teacher you love, follow their rules. um, Kristen asks, did I start practicing on friends and myself before doing it professionally? Absolutely. So first and foremost, in the first degree, we emphasize hands-on self-treatment as the cornerstone of all Reiki practice. How can we show up for someone else if we haven't first shown up for ourselves? We can't serve from an empty vessel. So yeah, definitely self-treatment is the way to go. Matthew asks about any tips for choosing quality online Reiki courses. I have received high quality online Reiki training. I have received low quality online Reiki training. I have received high quality in-person Reiki training. I've received low quality in-person Reiki training. So the format alone doesn't make it good or effective for everybody. I would say that the best thing you can do is get to know the teacher rather than just picking something blind from Google results. Ask questions, find out how they teach, how they practice, find out what Reiki means to them, ask them about what role the precepts play in their practice, find out what the expectations are. Like, is it a pre-recorded class? Do you get a live initiation? Is there homework? There are all kinds of questions that you can ask to make sure that it's going to fit your learning style, because not every teacher's teaching style matches every learner's learning style. And that's really important. I recognize that I'm not for everybody, and I think most Reiki teachers also realize that too. If you want some pointers for kind of sifting through all the options, chapter 2 of Foundations of Reiki Ryoho is called Learning Reiki, and there is a little section in here toward the end on page 42 called Finding the Right Teacher. You can certainly adapt that to the right online teacher as well. So thanks for asking. Right. Any other questions? Oh, here's one. Margaret, I just finished my level 1 training with the Let Animals Lead method of Animal Reiki with Kathleen. I want to thank you for encouraging me to do that. She's been amazing. Oh, I'm so, so thankful you got to connect with one of my most beloved Reiki teachers, one of my high quality online Reiki experiences, in fact. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. So Kristen asks, does the person you're working on have to believe in the treatment to feel benefits? Well, consent and agency are really important things, and we always want to recognize the roles those play in the therapeutic praxis, the trust building that they offer. But if we, again, want to look at a historical precedent, there is a little teeny question and answer guide as part of a larger document that Usui himself actually wrote. And this little question and answer guide is prefaced with the title Kokai Denju Setsume, Explanation of Open Teachings, or more poetically, why can anyone sign up for a class? And so he answers questions from whoever his audience is. I don't know if they were a live audience or if they're just, frequently asked questions of the 1920s, but the question does come up, does someone have to believe in Reiki for it to work? And he says, absolutely not. Reiki works for people you can't explain it to. For example, the ones who are unconscious, the ones who are pre-verbal, the ones who are otherwise nonverbal, because Reiki touches a part of us that is beyond the scope of words, that is beyond the scope of duality, and therefore beyond the scope of belief. So I always encourage you to practice with folks who want to practice with you, because there's a better relationship you tend to get out of someone who's not rolling their eyes and going, go ahead, do that thing, versus someone who's invested in their own well-being. That's not to say the person rolling their eyes isn't going to feel better. Um, Sometimes those are my favorite success stories. I know a lot of Reiki practitioners who have skeptical spouses who, when they've got a sore knee or ankle or back, are like, babe, can you do the thing? And, of course, we always do the thing. Um, so it's not so much that we can block the benefits, but sometimes the benefits we experience begin with great subtlety. And humans are very guilty of confirmation bias, for good or for bad. So if someone's super skeptical, they're probably not going to be looking for those subtle signs that Reiki has an effect. And also, who determines if Reiki's working, right? That's such a big conversation to have another day. Um, so yeah, it's a it's a complicated answer, but no, you don't have to believe in it for it to work, is the short version of the answer. Roberta says, when I do Reiki, sometimes I find a troubled area and will use a specific crystal bowl or tuning fork to release it. Is that common? I will say that is not a Reiki practice. That is a wonderful healing modality. And the beautiful thing about Reiki is that it is so supportive of all the other things that we do. Reiki is malleable. It becomes this container of flexible shape that we can put other things inside, and it also changes shape to fit inside other containers. So some Reiki practitioners are aromatherapists and they will use essential oils. Some are color therapists and will use colored light. Some folks are sound therapists and will use tuning forks or crystal bowls. We just have to remember that those extra things are not Reiki. They're wonderful. And I'm not saying don't use them, but we have to, especially since our conversation today is about traditional Reiki, they sit outside of the container of traditional Reiki. They play nicely with it, but the container isn't that big. So if we engage with more than one practice at a time, I think it is nice just to let people know, hey, these are all my credentials. Some of them are Reiki, some of them are other things. A la carte, we're going to do a little bit of everything. And most recipients are going to be pretty darn great. But I will tell you, I've actually had the experience of someone getting off the table at the end of a session and it goes, so how are we feeling? Like, oh, I feel wonderful. But I don't think you got the whole training because, yeah, you didn't put any rocks on my forehead and you didn't drop any essential oils around me. And I didn't hear any drums or singing bowls. So I don't know, maybe your Reiki teacher didn't teach you the whole thing. And, that's a great opportunity to have a conversation about what techniques are Reiki techniques and what are just other wonderful things that their previous practitioners may have engaged with. But I think if there are other previous practitioners that had open conversations about where Reiki starts and ends, it might have helped them choose the right person, because maybe I wasn't the right person for them. Maybe they wanted someone who had all those extended techniques, which I just don't offer as part of Reiki sessions. And I'd be happy to connect them with someone who does. So nothing wrong with doing it. Lots of folks do, lots of folks don't. um, Talia is asking what crystals might I suggest to incorporate for Reiki sessions on my dad who has Alzheimer's. So because Reiki, and this kind of goes back to that same conversation, because crystals are not traditionally a part of Reiki in a context like this, there's actually like one tiny footnote in Reiki history where crystals show up, but it's complicated and we won't get into that now. Um, I generally keep these as two separate practices in my toolbox. If someone asks for both at the same time, I'm going to make a person happy, of course. But I would hesitate trying to be prescriptive here, because I am not a qualified medical practitioner and I can't prescribe or diagnose anything. And I'm sure you know that you're not asking me that, but because this is going to end up on a public forum, I have to say those things out loud. So if one wanted to incorporate crystals and a Reiki session together for anyone, I would think, big picture. What what are the obstacles to healing? What are the obstacles to balance this person is experiencing? And what crystals best reflect the tools they need to get over that? So for someone who has Alzheimer's, maybe what represents clarity, what represents fortitude, what represents resilience. And then you can customize the crystal you choose to that individual instead of being prescriptive and doing this kind of if-then causal relationship, because it's far more nuanced than that. So I hope you will accept my not real answer there. But I always encourage people to really kind of feel that out and think for themselves, because this is a human you have a personal connection with that I don't. Your choice is going to be informed by that connection. And I think that's way better than what I could pick out of a book. All right. Any other questions? I think this might be a great point to sign off then. So I hope you all have a wonderful night. Please reach out with future questions. You've got my contact via my website. You can find more about what I do there. So thanks so much and have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Thank you.
Great
Night.
talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.